Chapter 7. The Civil War. The Civil War was the most tragic blood-letting of the people of Shem in recorded history. This people, religious refugees from Canaanite oppressors and massacres in Europe, succeeded in establishing in the United States the most productive society in the world. Their constitution had unleashed the great talents of this people to do God's work on this earth. Of course, Satan's people, the Canaanites, were livid with hatred and envy. If there is one passion which America has always excited in the world, it is the passion of envy. The United States was the most admired nation in the world, because its constitution guaranteed to its legal citizens the unfettered right of personal liberty, something which no other nation could offer to its people. In the states of the South, the people of Shem had carved from the wilderness productive plantations and impressive manor houses, built in the tradition of Greek neoclassicism, and expressing their conviction that this was the only way that they wished to live on this earth. Like the ancient Greeks, the people of Shem had slaves to attend to their daily needs, the descendants of Canaan, on whom the curse of Canaan had been pronounced, and which committed them to that status. Despite the efforts of the people of Shem to maintain their slaves in a healthy and comfortable environment, from an economic standpoint alone, this was an absolute requirement, because the bulk of their operating capital was invested in them. The existence of these slaves became their Achilles heel, which the Canaanites cleverly used as the weapon with which to mount an attack against them. There were many contemporaneous records attesting to the kindly treatment of the slaves, such as the observations of Samuel Phillips Day, special correspondent for the London Morning Herald, who wrote, "On Sunday, June 8, 1861, in Asheville, Kentucky, I took a drive with some friends. Judge of my surprise, reader, when I found almost the entire Negro population abroad, some parading thoroughfares, and others riding about in carriages. They were dressed so showily and so finely, and appeared so happy and contented, that I was virtually forced to exclaim, 'Surely these people are not slaves?' The response was, 'Certainly they are.' Some of the women wore lace shawls and gold watches and looked, only for their color, like London duchesses going to a ball. The men too were well attired. I reflected for a moment on the condition of British labourers and London needlewomen. The contrast was too painful to dwell upon. The thought flashed across my mind that there was nothing so very wicked in slavery after all, that it possessed a bright side as well as a dark side." Samuel Phillips Day's comments were well taken. It is doubtful if any southern plantation owner would have treated his slaves as badly as the average British workingman was treated by his brutal black nobility landowners and factory operators. It was no accident that world communism, Fabianism, and other desperate remedies were born, not in the slave quarters of the South, but in the working-class districts of London and Manchester. However, the daily life of the slaves in the South, as observed by many travelers, was obscured for all time by the relentless promotion of a single book, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Even today, any black who dares to say that perhaps we are not as badly off as our brethren in the jungles of Africa is hooted down as an Uncle Tom. Only warfare to the death is recommended by the militant Masonic activists. Propaganda, invasion, and civil war, these are the only accepted remedies for the injustices visited upon the blacks. It was no accident that Harriet Beecher Stowe's book became the greatest bestseller of its time. It was tirelessly promoted throughout the entire nation, in the most successful book promotion campaign in our history. The force which promoted Uncle Tom's Cabin was the same force which, as early as 1799, sought the dissolution of our constitutional republic, which had continued its efforts in the Essex Junto, and which found its final fruition in the Civil War. Despite repeated provocations from the Canaanites in the north, the southern states proved remarkably tractable, freely making concessions to demands which were intended only to force them into war. The Missouri Compromise, written in 1820, was accepted even though it prohibited slavery in the new state. It did restrict voting privileges to free white male citizens, thus excluding women, slaves, and Indians from exercising the ballot. In 1849, the people of California adopted a constitution which prohibited slavery. The Compromise of 1850 provided that the prohibition of slavery should be left up to the individual states, thus thwarting the Canaanites in their attempts to make this problem an excuse for federal intervention and a cause of war between the states. It is a matter of historical record that the Civil War was precipitated by the action against Fort Sumter in South Carolina, across the bay from Charleston. This opening of hostilities can be traced directly to the power of the Scottish Rite in Charleston, which is known officially as the Mother Lodge of the World. It was founded by Moses Lindo as the King Solomon Lodge. Lindo had a monopoly on the indigo trade, a much-needed dye similar to the Phoenicia, or purple dye, which had been the principal monopoly of his Canaanite ancestors, and who changed their name from Canaanite to Phoenicians because of this monopoly. According to the Encyclopaedia Judaica, other founders of the King Solomon Lodge included Isaac and Abraham da Costa. Da Costa was one of the leading names among the Marranos. In 1793, the cornerstone of a new synagogue, Beth Elohim, was laid in Charleston according to the Rite of Freemasons. Charleston is also known as the cradle of Reform Judaism in America. We have previously noted that this movement originated in Frankfurt on Main with the Rothschilds, and that it has culminated in the successes of World Zionism. The Charleston Cemetery dates from 1764. Other organizers of the Charleston Lodge included Stephen Moran, 25th degree Inspector for North America, who had been initiated into the Rite of Perfection in Paris in 1761, Henry A. Franken, Deputy Inspector General for North America, 25th degree, initiated in Jamaica in 1762, Augustine Prevost, later commander of British forces in North America during the Revolutionary War, 25th degree, initiated in Jamaica in 1774, Moses Michael Hayes, 25th degree, initiated in Boston in 1767 as Deputy Inspector General for North America, John Mitchell, 25th degree, initiated in Charleston, named Deputy for South Carolina, B. Spitzer, Deputy for Georgia, Moses Cohen, 25th degree, initiated in Philadelphia in 1781, AFA de Grasse Tilly, 25th degree, initiated in Charleston 1796. John Mitchell had been residing in Philadelphia during the Revolutionary War. Through his Masonic connections, he had himself named as Deputy Quartermaster General of the American Army, although he remained in Philadelphia throughout the British occupation. He and his co-worker, Benedict Arnold, were later tried on charges of corruption, stemming from their illegal diversions of army supplies, but here again, because of their powerful Masonic defenders, they were acquitted. Mitchell later moved to South Carolina. Count Alexander de Grasse Tilly was the son of the French admiral who aided George Washington in the defeat of the British forces at Yorktown. The opposing forces then sat down for a cordial Masonic banquet. De Grasse later set up Scottish Rites Supreme Councils throughout Europe. He was later named Supreme Commander of France. He played the crucial role in promoting insurrectionary activity in South Carolina, which culminated in the firing on Fort Sumter. Another member of the Charleston Lodge, James Moultrie, was the principal figure behind the nullification crisis in South Carolina during the 1820s and 1830s. He was named Grand Secretary General of the Scottish Rite for all of the southern states. During the 19th century, Masonic agitators traveled about the world, inflaming the populaces with passionate cries for liberation and the rights of man. Unfortunately for those who were deceived by these manipulations, the only rights they were pursuing were the rights of Masonic Canaanites to battle and exterminate the people of Shem. Every other consideration was subordinated to this primary goal. As a result, every nation which was lured into the rights of man trap became an absolute dictatorship whose officials used their powers to destroy the people of Shem, their demonic goal, and part of their satanic rebellion against God. As Grand Master, Lafayette directed the Juarez Revolution in Mexico. In South America, Bernardo O'Higgins and Simon Bolivar, both of whom were Masons, led the revolutionary forces against Spain in country after country. Since the Spanish governments in these countries were also Catholic, these revolutions proved to be an integral part of Masonry's openly declared war against the Catholic Church. In Italy, Mazzini and Garibaldi led the atheistic revolutionary forces which culminated in the arrest of the Pope and the establishment of unification in Italy in 1860. From the outset, this Masonic uprising was planned and financed by British Secret Intelligence Service, and directed by Lord Palmerston, Foreign Minister of the British Empire. When Louis Kossuth, the Hungarian revolutionary, visited the United States, Masonic organizations throughout the country planned large-scale demonstrations and victory banquets for him. It is doubtful that any visitor to these shores has previously or since been lionized to the extent that Louis Kossuth was received. Even today, there are still many buildings and avenues in American towns throughout the country which are named after Kossuth, memorializing this leader of Freemasonry. In 1845, Mazzini originated the Young America movement in the United States. Although primarily active in rural areas as a farmers' movement, it was directed by Mazzini to play an active role in the growing abolitionist movement, which he also directed. His friend, William Lloyd Garrison, who later wrote the introduction to Mazzini's authorized biography, became the most inflammatory of the abolitionist propagandists. He called his newspaper The Liberator. Garrison started this paper in 1831. From the outset, it was liberally financed by unnamed backers, who saw to it that free subscriptions to The Liberator were distributed throughout the southern states. The state of Georgia was moved to offer $500 reward for Garrison's arrest or for the detention of any member of his American Anti-Slavery Society. Garrison frequently went to London for conferences with Mazzini on the strategy of the abolitionist movement. They usually met at the offices of the well-known London solicitor, William Ashurst. Few Southerners have ever heard the name of Mazzini, and even fewer know that this fiery Masonic revolutionary was the actual instigator of the Civil War. He is privately known among the cognoscenti, or Gnostics, as the godfather of the anti-slavery campaign in the United States. This abolitionist propaganda caused widespread resentment throughout the South. On December 16, 1835, the state of South Carolina issued a formal resolution on the matter, resolved, that the formation of the abolitionist societies and the acts and doings of certain fanatics calling themselves abolitionists in the non-slaveholding states of this confederacy, are in direct violation of the obligations of the Compact of the Union, disocial, and incendiary in the extreme. Note that in 1835, South Carolina used the term common until after the outcome of the Civil War, a confederacy of states associated under the provisions of a compact, the Constitution of the United States. The abolitionist propaganda did constitute a direct invasion of the southern states and as such was an undeclared state of war. It was also, as the South Carolina resolution pointed out, a direct violation of the terms of the compact. Nevertheless, this invasion by propaganda continued, until it was at last followed by the direct military invasion of the Civil War. Despite the fact that slavery existed in the southern states under the direct authority of the biblical curse of Canaan, the war against the people of Shem was conducted without mercy by the invading Canaanites, who faithfully followed the precepts of their founder in the will of Canaan: hate your masters, and never tell the truth. The ideological successor to the Edwardine conspiracy and the Essex junta in the New England states was a curious, pseudo-religious cult, often called the New England religion, but also known as Unitarianism and Transcendentalism. It was a direct spawn of the demonic cult of Baal, as adapted through the centuries by such liberalizing and humane influences as Pythagoreanism, Neoplatonism, and secular humanism, which had been bought and paid for by the banking family, the de Medicis. The New England religion, quite simply, was the latest modern heresy preached against the people of Shem. The cult was directed by Rev. William Channing. One of his principal assistants was a teacher named John Brown, the son of the infamous revolutionary who was to die on the gallows for the insurrection at Harper's Ferry. This cult survives today principally in the preachings of some who call themselves fundamentalists. These renegades preach the doctrine of the will of Canaan, and they work avidly for the final defeat and extermination of the people of Shem. These transcendentalists did not bother to conceal the fact that they took the basics of their religious doctrines directly from the Kabbalah, preaching that each person has an oversoul, and that there is no final authority in any religious matter, thus invalidating the entire Bible and the pronouncements of God. Their true leaning was always dominated by Oriental despotism, and their doctrines originated in the Far East. Consequently, their first line of attack was the overthrowing of the Constitution of the United States, the principal safeguard of the people of Shem. Their campaign resulted in the adoption of amendments which totally invalidated the original intent of this Constitution. This is the basis of decisions of federal judges in federal courts today, always against the people of Shem, always strengthening the stranglehold of Oriental despotism over our captive people. At one point, the leader of the abolitionists, William Garrison, publicly burned a copy of the Constitution, calling it a covenant with hell. The abolitionists repeatedly denied that there was any authority for slavery in the Bible, thus ignoring the curse of Canaan, Genesis chapter 9 verse 25, and many other commandments. They also worked desperately to forestall the peaceful emancipation movement in the South. The gradual freeing of the slaves, which had been led by Thomas Jefferson, had received widespread approbation among the plantation owners. They welcomed emancipation because they had come face to face with the economic reality which has made a shambles of the communist empire, that without incentives and the promise of ultimate gain, few people were willing to do more than the absolute minimum of labor to survive. Economic growth was impossible in this situation. Emancipation was not merely a humanitarian measure, it was welcomed by the plantation owners because they faced ruin due to the daily demands of maintaining their increasing slave populations. Thomas Jefferson was an outstanding example. Despite his brilliant career, he died bankrupt. He tried crop after crop in desperate attempts to make Monticello a profitable enterprise. In every case, he was defeated by the mounting expenses of caring for his slaves. The religious assault on the Constitution of the United States, the compact which had been drafted by the people of Shem in order to protect their religious freedom, now took a more ominous turn. In 1857, the financial leaders of the Canaanite powers, the House of Rothschild, assembled to celebrate the wedding of Lionel's daughter, Leonora, to her cousin, Alphonse, son of James de Rothschild of Paris. At this gathering, Disraeli said, "Under this roof are the heads of the family of Rothschild, a name famous in every capital of Europe and every division of the globe. If you like, we shall divide the United States into two parts, one for you, James, and one for you, Lionel. Napoleon shall do exactly and all that I shall advise him." p. 228. The Rothschilds, by John Reeves. The tragic civil war which the Canaanites planned and executed against the people of Shem in the southern states actually began in 1859, with the invasion of the South by the homicidal maniac, John Brown. The abolitionists had already spent millions of dollars to promote slave rebellions in the South, but this expensive propaganda had very little effect. As Day and other observers had reported, the slaves were leading very comfortable lives. After this tactic failed, it became obvious to the conspirators that an actual military invasion was the only solution to their campaign. The merchant bankers of New England, who were directly controlled by the Rothschilds, were now instructed to finance a military attack against the South. Their instrumentality was the already well-known terrorist, John Brown. He was financed by a group famed as the Secret Six, which was composed of Thomas Wentworth Higginson, Reverend Theodore Parker, Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe, married to Julia Ward, from a wealthy banking family who later wrote Battle Hymn of the Republic, Franklin Benjamin Sanborn, George Luther Stearns, and Gerrit Smith. Smith had been John Brown's first financial angel. He was the son of the business partner of John Jacob Astor, East India Company, the opium trade, and British intelligence. His mother was a Livingston. He was related to the Masonic leaders, Edward and Robert Livingston. Smith was the largest landowner in the state of New York, holding 1 million acres, which included land he had given to John Brown in 1848. Smith's total contribution to John Brown's military raids and other radical causes came to more than $8 million, a tremendous sum in those days. Reverend Theodore Parker typified the religious inspiration of the abolitionist movement. His mother was a Stearns, and he married into the Cabot family. He was educated at the Harvard Divinity School, and he became a leading transcendentalist and Congregationalist minister. He was always an activist in the Masonic tradition. In 1854, he had been indicted by a grand jury for inciting an attack on a courthouse where a runaway slave was being detained. He was an active member of the Vigilance Committee, and he was the principal organizer of the Secret Six to finance John Brown's raid. He later became an expatriate, living in Europe. He died in Florence, birthplace of secular humanism. Thomas Wentworth Higginson, of the leading New England banking family, was from Newburyport, Massachusetts, the birthplace of Albert Pike, who became the national leader of American Masonry. Higginson actively assisted Rev. Parker in the attack on the courthouse and engaged in many other illegal and nefarious activities. His cousin married Theodore Roosevelt. Samuel Gridley Howe and his wife, Julia, founded and edited a fiery anti-slavery newspaper, The Commonwealth. Like so many of the Canaanite agitators in the United States, Gridley was descended from Calvinist revolutionaries. His ancestor was an officer in Cromwell's army, John Ward of Gloucester, who later fled to the United States to avoid punishment for the atrocities he committed under the banner of Cromwell. Franklin Benjamin Sanborn was a leading disciple of Reverend Parker and Ralph Waldo Emerson. The Senate ordered his arrest in 1860. He had been the principal agent for John Brown in New York since 1857. George Luther Stearns married into the Train family. He was the leader of the Free Soilers, the anti-slavery agitators in the state of Kansas. Their depredations gave rise to the term, Bloody Kansas. He donated large sums to John Brown and bought a farm for the terrorist and his family. The chief agent for Stearns in Kansas was Martin Conway. Originally from Baltimore, Conway was sent to Kansas to lead the Free State forces there. He later became the first congressman from Kansas. On October 11, 1873, he fired 3 shots at Senator Pomeroy, wounding him. Conway was taken to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, where he was judged hopelessly insane. He later died there. Other leading New Englanders deeply involved in the planning of uprisings in the South included Samuel Cabot. He paid for $4,000 worth of rifles which were sent to John Brown's forces in Kansas. The guns were used to massacre entire families during John Brown's orgy of terrorism. The Cabot Bank later provided $57,000 for John Brown's military expenses. There is no record that it was ever repaid, or that any attempt was made to collect it. It was a donation to the cause of terrorism, a familiar technique of bankers. Other financial supporters of John Brown included John Murray Forbes, a wealthy railroad builder. His mother was a Perkins, who served on the Republican National Committee. Between 1827 and 1843, the plans of the conspirators received a temporary setback with the emergence of the anti-Masonic Party as a national force. This political movement threatened to expose the entire conspiracy as a Masonic operation. From its outset, the anti-Masonic Party was handicapped by its inability to penetrate the shroud of secrecy which veiled every act of the conspirators. Without direct evidence of this conspiracy which could be presented in court or laid before the people, they soon lost their popular support. In fact, they were soon infiltrated by the very conspirators whom they sought to expose, and they were rendered impotent. Albert Pike later boasted that the anti-Masonic Party actually was of great assistance to us. After its dissolution, Freemasonry never again faced any organized opposition in the entire United States. Those who mention this subject are quickly discredited as poor overwrought fools and paranoid know-nothings who see Masons behind every tree. In most cases, they are quickly consigned to the nearest lunatic asylum. Soviet communism's handling of its dissidents. For some years prior to the outbreak of the Civil War, the young American Masonic conspiracy had been active in the southern states, laying the groundwork for the approaching Civil War. A native New Yorker, John A. Quitman, moved to Mississippi and married into a wealthy Southern family. He was given the warrant to form a Scottish Rite organization in Mississippi. On February 1, 1848, the Freemason magazine of Boston carried the notice that Brother John Quitman, who was now a Major General in the United States Army, had been inaugurated as Sovereign Grand Inspector General of the 33rd degree. All Southern lodges were now ordered to obey him. Quitman had also become one of the most outspoken leaders of the secessionist movement in the South. This movement was now firmly controlled by the Masonic Canaanite conspirators. Quitman also sponsored a plan to annex Mexico, and financed an invasion of Cuba by mercenaries. He had been elected governor of Mississippi, when he was indicted in New Orleans for his part in the planned Cuban invasion, and he was forced to resign from that office. Here again was the deep involvement of a leader of the Scottish Rite, the revolutionary arm of Freemasonry, in planning wars and revolutions throughout the world. The ideological leader of the Cuban invasion was one Jane McManus, who had last been heard from as the girlfriend of the revolutionist, Aaron Burr. In order to build popular support for his presidential campaign, Senator Stephen Douglas, Lincoln's opponent, hired one George Sanders, a young America agent, to edit the Democratic Party Review. Sanders is identified in Who's Who by profession as a revolutionist. The American political agent of the Hudson Bay Company, he had worked for the Bank of England, and as United States consul in London, he had worked closely with Mazzini. London was at that time the world headquarters of Masonic revolutionary movements. Sanders soon devoted the pages of the Democratic Party Review to lauding the efforts of Mazzini and other Masonic agitators. In 1853, Killian H. Van Rensselaer, one of the New York patroons, or hereditary landlords, opened the western headquarters of the Scottish Rite in Cincinnati, Ohio. At the same time, another secret organization, the Knights of the Golden Circle, began its operations in Cincinnati. The organization, which, as usual, was well financed, soon enlisted and trained some 100,000 members in paramilitary tactics. These members spread throughout the southern states. They formed the nucleus of what would become the Confederate Army during the Civil War. Most Southerners neither envisioned nor prepared for an armed struggle with the North. The Southern cause was always directed and promoted by Northern infiltrators. The stage was now set for the Civil War. The nation was further polarized by the Dred Scott case. Scott, an elderly and infirm Negro who was financially supported by his owners, was pushed into a direct legal confrontation, amply financed from New England merchant bankers' funds. The case went to the Supreme Court. Listed in the court records as Dred Scott v. Sanford, 19 Howard 393, the matter was decided in an opinion by Chief Justice Taney dated March 6, 1857. The question is simply this: can a Negro, whose ancestors were imported into this country, and sold as slaves, become a member of the political community formed and brought into existence by the Constitution of the United States, and as such become entitled to all the rights and privileges, and immunities, guaranteed by that instrument to the citizen? The words "people of the United States" and "citizens" are synonymous terms, and mean the same thing: the sovereign people. The question before us is, whether the class of persons described in the plea in abatement comprise a portion of this people and are constituent members of this sovereignty? We think they are not, and that they are not included, and were not intended to be included, under the word citizens in the Constitution, and can, therefore, claim none of the rights and privileges which that instrument provides for and secures to citizens of the United States. On the contrary, they were at that time considered as a subordinate and inferior class of beings, who had been subjugated by the dominant race, and, whether emancipated or not, yet remained subject to their authority, and had no rights or privileges but such as those who held the power and the government might choose to grant them. In the opinion of the court, the legislation and histories of the times, and the language used in the Declaration of Independence, show that neither the class of persons who had been imported as slaves, nor their descendants, whether they had become free or not, were then acknowledged as a part of the people, nor intended to be included in the general words used in that memorable instrument. They had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order, and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. This opinion was at that time fixed and universal in the civilized portion of the white race. It was regarded as an axiom in morals as well as in politics, which no one thought of disputing, or supposed to be open to dispute, and men in every grade and position in society daily and habitually acted upon it in their private pursuits, as well as in matters of public concern, without doubting for a moment the correctness of this opinion. There are two clauses in the Constitution which point directly and specifically to the Negro race as a separate class of persons, and show clearly that they were not regarded as a portion of the people or citizens of the government then formed, the right to import slaves until the year 1808. And the states pledged to each other to maintain the right of property of the master, by delivering up to him any slave who may have escaped from his service. The right of property in a slave is distinctly and expressly affirmed in the Constitution. The Circuit Court of the United States had no jurisdiction in this case, and could give no judgment on it. Its judgment for the defendant must, consequently, be reversed, and a mandate issued directing the suit to be dismissed for want of jurisdiction. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court paid dearly for this decision. His name has almost entirely been erased from the legal history of this nation. He was repeatedly threatened with house arrest during the Civil War by President Lincoln, and after the war, his two elderly daughters, shunned as prospective brides, eked out a precarious existence as government clerks at the very bottom of the pay scale, always on the verge of complete destitution. After the Dred Scott decision, events moved rapidly toward an actual military confrontation, with the Knights of the Golden Circle taking their places throughout the southern states. John Brown then attacked Harper's Ferry, an incident which was intended to set off a slave uprising throughout the South. The anticipated popular revolution failed to materialize, and Brown was captured and hanged. To this day, he remains a martyr in the Kabbalistic circles of New England, the fundamentalists. Their ideological leader, Ralph Waldo Emerson, wrote, "He makes the gallows as glorious as the cross." Emerson later promoted John Brown as a new saint in the calendar. In order to arouse provocation for the Fort Sumter attack, Lincoln now dispatched heavy reinforcements to the fort. Even his Secretary of War, Seward, objected to his move, suggesting instead that Fort Sumter be yielded peacefully to the state of South Carolina. Lincoln himself was eagerly anticipating the approaching bloodbath and would hear of no compromise. He is known to have suffered from hereditary insanity, which did not come from the Lincoln family, for they were not his actual forebears. His mother, Nancy Hanks, being homeless, had been taken in as a charitable act by the Inlow family. She was thrown out by Mrs. Inlow after she had become pregnant by Abraham Inlow. Ward H. Lame, Lincoln's law partner, later wrote a biography of Lincoln stating that Lincoln was of illegal parentage, and referring to his real father as Abraham Inlow. The Yorkville Inquirer, April 8, 1863, noted that Lincoln's mother, Nancy Hanks, was a single woman of low degree. Canaan means low. Ed, generally reputed to have from 1/8 to 1/16 Negro blood in her veins, and who always associated with Negroes on terms of equality. The Atlanta Intelligencer in 1863 noted of his vice president, Hannibal Hamlin, who had been named after the historic leader of the Canaanite forces of Carthage, Hannibal, that Hamlin was identified by State Senator Hon. John Burham, of Hancock County, Maine, who lived in the area and knew of Hamlin's ancestry. The senator reported that Hamlin's great-grandfather was a mulatto, who had married a Canadian woman. His grandfather during the Revolutionary War commanded a company composed only of mulattoes, Negroes, and Indians under Generals Sullivan and Greene. This Captain Hamlin is recorded as having embezzled the funds sent to pay his troops. He also was said to have stolen wine and other supplies. The father of Hannibal Hamlin's father lived in Paris, Maine, and had a brother named Africa. When Hannibal Hamlin was born, one of his uncles peered into his cradle and exclaimed, "For God's sake, how long will this damned black blood remain in our family?" In Louisiana, John Slidell, who was also a New Yorker, was the leader of the state's secessionist party. His second in command was one Judah P. Benjamin. Slidell was the Masonic protege of the Grand Master, Edward Livingston, also of New York, a key member of the Aaron Burr treason apparatus. Benjamin, from the West Indies, was a British subject. He was hired as a law clerk by Slidell. He later became the Secretary of State in the Confederate government. After the Civil War, he was permitted to leave the United States without hindrance, and he lived his later years in splendid luxury as one of the highest-paid Queen's Counsels in London, while his former superior, Jefferson Davis, languished in a federal prison, burdened with heavy chains. In Texas, the secessionist conspirators were blocked for a time by Sam Houston, a Virginian who was the founder of Texas. Houston ruled that the secessionist efforts were illegal. The conspirators then succeeded in deposing Governor Houston by a rump election, which was similar to the tactics which the Cromwellians had used to condemn King Charles I in England. The conspirators then claimed that their secessionist delegates had received 40,000 votes, as compared to only 10,000 for Houston's supporters. This was later cited as the popular support for the insurrection, as the action taken by the Southern states was later termed. The Confederacy was officially established at Montgomery, Alabama, chaired by Scottish Rite Supreme Commander Howell Cobb. He was ably assisted by Scottish Rite backers from the Charleston Mother Lodge and representatives from other Masonic groups. Thus the American people were maneuvered into a civil war which they neither envisioned nor desired. They were manipulated by Masonic Canaanite conspirators working together in the northern and the southern states. The resulting bloodbath proved to be the greatest disaster ever suffered by the people of Shem. The great civilization which they had spent some 200 years building in this land was now swept away, gone with the wind. The constitution which they had written to protect their existence as the people of Shem was scrapped, being replaced by amendments which reduced them to the status of serfs, while giving the Canaanites total power to set up a tyrannical dictatorship. Nevertheless, the anticipated division of the United States into two small, weak countries, each to be easily controlled from the European headquarters of the Rothschilds, failed to take place. At one point, the massing of French and Spanish troops in Mexico seemed to doom the future of the United States, and to bring about the division which the Rothschilds desired. However, the Tsar of Russia, a great leader of the Shemite people, learned of the plan. He immediately dispatched two of his fleets to the United States, one which landed at San Francisco, which was commanded by Admiral Lasovsky, and the second squadron, which arrived in New York Harbor, commanded by Admiral A. A. Popov. Needless to say, these names are not encountered by students of American history. However, the presence of these Russian fleets served to preserve the Union. James de Rothschild was left without his anticipated empire in Mexico, while Lionel was forced to forego his control over the northern states. Because of these good offices on behalf of the Union, the Tsar was later murdered by Rothschild agents, and Russia was condemned to be turned over to the atrocities of the demonic Canaanite revolutionaries. The Civil War ravaged the southern states, while leaving the north untouched. The civilization of the people of Shem was in ruins. Once again, as during the Revolutionary War, hordes of German mercenaries moved through the south. Southern ladies reported that their homes had been put to the torch by Union soldiers who could speak only guttural English. Yet these horrors were only a harbinger of what was to come. The defeat of the underfinanced and poorly prepared southern states had been a foregone conclusion, as they were overrun by the numerical and financial superiority of the northern states. Their defeat was followed by an unrivaled brutality toward the vanquished population. For generations afterward, Southern families suffered genetic diseases directly attributable to the starvation forced upon them by their conquerors. Such formerly unknown illnesses as scurvy, rickets, gum disease, and other diseases gave rise to the depiction of the Southern people, which is still universal in the New York-owned and controlled publishing industry, movies, and television, the Jodes of Tobacco Road. However, no explanation of their pitiful condition is ever offered. The 1949 World Book states under the title Reconstruction, this plan was unmatched in history for its generosity to the defeated foe. This is typical of the anti-Southern bias of the publishing industry. No Southern writer can be published in New York unless he depicts his fellow Southerners as alcoholic womanizers and homosexuals. In fact, this generosity consisted of military occupation for many years after the war, ruinous taxation, systematic starvation, and brutal military courts in which the Southern people found it impossible to obtain justice. The same system is largely in place today. In his first inaugural address, Lincoln had clearly stated, "I have no purpose, direct or indirect, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." Despite this pledge, on January 1, 1863, Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation. It had actually been previously written on September 22, 1862. Lincoln had prepared the first draft as early as July, 1862. Lincoln excused his action as due to military necessity, and therefore warranted by the Constitution. No court challenge was ever made to this claim. On the same day that Lincoln issued this proclamation, the Illinois state legislature, hardly a hotbed of Southern reactionaries, issued a formal denunciation of the proclamation, resolved that the Emancipation Proclamation of the President of the United States is as unwarrantable in military as in civil law, a gigantic usurpation, at once converting the war, professedly commenced by the administration for the vindication of the authority of the Constitution, into the crusade for the sudden unconditional and violent liberation of 3 million Negro slaves. The proclamation invites servile insurrection as an element in this crusade, a means of warfare, the inhumanity and diabolism of which are without example in civilian warfare, and which we denounce, and which the civilized world will denounce, as an ineffaceable disgrace to the American people. The key word in the Illinois legislature's resolution is diabolism. Perhaps someone in the legislature realized that this was the triumph of the will of Canaan, a celebration of the demonic. The Masonic Canaanite forces throughout the world hailed the Emancipation Proclamation as a great victory for their program of worldwide revolution. Garibaldi, at that time the most famous Masonic leader and revolutionary in the world, signed a proclamation from Italy to Lincoln saying, "Will to you, redeemed sons of Ham." Whether Garibaldi knew of Lincoln's actual origins is not known. Certainly he hailed him as a fellow revolutionary. A little-known incident of the Civil War was Lincoln's offer to Garibaldi to take the commander-in-chief's post of the armies of the United States in 1861. He repeated the offer in 1862. Garibaldi had considered it seriously, but was forced to decline because of other commitments. European writers generally were appalled at the excesses committed by the Union troops and the Lincoln administration during the war. The great French writer, Alfred de Vigny, had written to a Southern lady on September 10, 1862, "Those abominable acts of cruelty perpetrated by the Northern armies in New Orleans remind one of the invasion of the barbarians, of Attila's Huns, or even worse than the Vandais. I well understand your hatred for those depraved and ferocious men who are drowning in blood the whole of your beloved country. A wise state is not one that resorts to brute force, to murder and fire in order to find a solution to the complex problems of states' rights. It is a question that should have been settled in public debate." A public debate was just what Masonic Canaanite conspirators did not want. They managed to avoid it each time the issue came up. The Times of London, October 21, 1862, editorially commented, "Is the name of Lincoln to be classified in the catalogue of monsters, wholesale assassins, and butchers of humanity? When blood begins to flow and shrieks come piercing through the darkness, Mr. Lincoln will wait until the rising flames tell that all is consummated, and then he will rub his hands and think that revenge is sweet." The Times did not know this, but Lincoln's entire political career was dedicated to the revenge of the Canaanites against the fair-skinned people of Shem, those who were always to be considered his enemies because of the color of his skin. The Civil War was merely the latest campaign in a battle which had been surreptitiously waged during the past 3,000 years. After Lincoln's assassination, the radical Republicans in Congress moved to impose even more draconian measures against the defeated South. The Southerners had offended the basic principle of Masonic Cananism, that is, Oriental despotism. Any refusal to obey the command of the dictatorial central government must automatically be followed by the severest punishment. No matter that the Constitution of the United States had been written by the people of Shem, or that it guaranteed them their states' rights, no matter that the federal government was legally confined in its authority to the District of Columbia by statute, no matter that no federal authority could enter any state except by express request of the state legislature. All of this was systematically violated, and now the violated ones were to endure even greater punishments. Hordes of carpetbaggers followed the federal troops into the southern states like avid camp followers. Federal courts and federal insane asylums were now set up in the states for the first time, in flagrant violation of the constitutional prohibitions against them. Now ensued a series of legal measures which were hailed by the revolutionary Mazzini, who was known as the prophet by Masonic organizations throughout the world. Mazzini enthused to the northern conquerors, "You have done more for us in 4 years than 50 years of teaching, preaching, and writing by your European brothers have been able to do." These measures effectively scrapped the Constitution. A hastily written Civil Rights Act was rushed through Congress. President Andrew Johnson immediately vetoed it, noting that the right to confer citizenship rested with the several states, and that the tendency of the bill is to resuscitate the spirit of rebellion. Indeed, many of the measures enacted by the radical Republicans were deliberately intended to provoke the Southerners into open resistance, so that they could then be exterminated by the overwhelming superiority of the military forces quartered in their states. The Civil Rights Act was passed over Johnson's veto, as were other similar measures. The federal troops now ordered that conventions be held in the southern states, which were akin to the conventions called by the perpetrators of the French Revolution. These conventions were ordered to do 3 things: 1. Nullify the Ordinance of Secession, 2. Repudiate all Confederate debts, and 3. Declare slavery abolished. Collier's Encyclopedia notes that these constitutional conventions held in the southern states were composed of 1. Scalawags, renegade Southerners, 2. Carpetbaggers, and 3. Negroes. The World Book lists them in slightly different order, as blacks, carpetbaggers, and scalawags. These conventions set up radical Republican governments in the southern states, which were nothing more than occupation governments, set up by military force. From 1868 to 1870, the southern states were once again represented in Congress, but only by delegates chosen by these 3 groups. Colliers notes that after Grant was elected president in 1868, it was important to maintain radical Republican governments of the southern states because these corrupt organizations provided votes for the Republican Party. Largely for this reason, the 15th Amendment was passed by Congress, and its ratification made a condition for readmission to the Union for Virginia, Mississippi, Texas, and Georgia. The Reconstruction governments in the South could only be sustained by force, thus Colliers makes a definitive statement about the 15th Amendment, that it was passed by blackmail of the Southern states, and that it was merely a political ploy of the Republican Party to maintain its political power. The reason that these brutal and alien state governments of the Masonic Canaanites could only be sustained by force was because of their unwavering hatred and brutality toward the people of Shem. Military and federal courts whose dicta can be enforced only by martial law can hardly be welcomed by any people. The military occupation of the South was similar to the present military occupation of East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and other European nations by the Soviet armies. An alien ideology was imposed on a defeated people by brute force. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States was enacted in 1865 by martial law. The 14th Amendment was enacted in 1868 by martial law. The 15th Amendment was enacted in 1870 by martial law. Military occupation of the southern states did not end until 1877, 12 years after the end of the Civil War. The occupation was maintained throughout those years solely as a punitive measure, in the hope of starving to death the last white survivors of the Civil War. Thus we find that the 13th Amendment, enacted in 1865, during military occupation, abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment, which changed the status of citizenship in the United States, was enacted in 1868 during the military occupation, and the 15th Amendment, dictating voting procedures, was enacted in 1870 during the military occupation. These amendments were similar to orders issued by the Soviet commanders today in East Germany or in Czechoslovakia. In 1868, when the 14th Amendment was ratified, Great Britain was still shipping boatloads of political prisoners to the Swan River in Western Australia as slave labour. Many of them were Irish politicals, who were deported to wipe out popular resistance to the British occupation of Ireland. The Civil Rights Act of April 9, 1866, stated, "Be it enacted, that all persons born in the United States and not subject to any foreign power, excluding Indians not taxed, are hereby declared to be citizens of the United States." This act nullified Art. 1, Sec. 2, Cl. 3 of the Constitution defining free persons. Even so, the Civil Rights Act continued the exclusion of Indians not taxed from citizenship. This act also excludes all members of the Masonic Order from citizenship because they are subject to a foreign power. The state of martial law under which these three amendments to the Constitution were ratified was authorized by the First Reconstruction Act, dated March 2, 1867, whereas no legal state governments or adequate protection of life or property now exists in the rebel states. The 10 southern states were thereby divided into 5 military districts. President Johnson vetoed the bill on the same day, noting that the bill places the people of the 10 states therein named under the absolute domination of military rule, but each state does have an actual government. Johnson further noted that the commanding officer is an absolute monarch, which was a clear violation of the provisions of the Constitution. He also said, "This is a bill passed by Congress in time of peace. The war had been over for 2 years." He further noted the absence of either war or insurrection, and that laws were already in harmonious operation in the southern states. Johnson concluded his veto message as follows: "The Constitution forbids the exercise of judicial power in any way but one that is, by the ordained and established courts." Thus Johnson excluded the exercise of military courts in the southern states. The Second Reconstruction Act, dated March 23, 1867, established military control over voting in the southern states. Free elections, anyone? President Johnson again vetoed it the same day. "No consideration could induce me to give my approval to such an election law for any purpose, and especially for the great purpose of framing the constitution of a state." The bill was passed over his veto. The Third Reconstruction Act, dated July 19, 1867, extended even greater powers to the military commanders of the southern states. It provided that no military officer in any district shall be bound by any civil officer of the United States. By giving absolute power to the commanding officer, the Third Reconstruction Act confirmed that the southern states were under absolute martial law, an important point to be brought up in a constitutional challenge to the validity of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. There is also the legal point to be made that if these amendments were and are illegal, having been enacted under martial law, all of the subsequent amendments to the Constitution are also invalid, since they not only are not numbered correctly, but they also must be considered as having been enacted according to the provisions of these three amendments, which changed the requirements for citizenship and voting rights. The Fourth Reconstruction Act imposed even greater voting restrictions on the militarily occupied southern states. Because he opposed the 4 Reconstruction Acts, which were patently unconstitutional, the Radical Republicans moved to impeach President Johnson and remove him from office. This has been a favorite tactic of those who have been defeated at the polls, as Presidents Nixon and Reagan were later to discover. The move to impeach Johnson lost by only 1 vote. The Radical Republicans had passed the 4 Reconstruction Acts only because they had previously taken the precaution in July of 1866 to reduce the number of justices on the Supreme Court from 10 to 7, fearing that President Johnson might appoint justices who would uphold his opinion of the Reconstruction Acts. Such is the law of the land. In April 1869, after Grant had been elected president, the Congress again increased the number of justices to 9, which remains the number today. Congress subsequently denounced presidents for their attempts to pack the Supreme Court, a privilege which seems to be reserved for themselves. Grant appointed justices who unanimously ruled to uphold the unconstitutional Reconstruction Acts. As Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Salmon P. Chase, the New York banker, resisted all challenges to the Reconstruction Acts by the captive Southern states, declaring that these acts were indeed constitutional. From 1830 to 1860, he had been renowned in Ohio for his work in aiding fugitive slaves. He was called the Attorney General for runaway slaves. He later founded the Chase Bank, which is now allied with Aaron Burr's Manhattan Company to form the Chase Manhattan Bank. The Radical Republicans in Congress were led by the fiery Thaddeus Stevens, a lawyer from Pennsylvania who, through judicious investments in real estate, had become the largest taxpayer in Gettysburg. He was a grotesque cripple, club-footed, described by his contemporaries as fox-featured, with hollow voice and a permanent pout. He was bald from the effects of some disease, and wore a chestnut-colored wig. For many years his only companion had been his mulatto mistress, one Lydia Smith. He died in her bed. The military occupation was the principal force upholding the depredations of the carpetbaggers in the southern states. They had swarmed in to quickly amass huge fortunes in land by having the property of the impoverished Southerners confiscated, they being unable to pay the ruinous increases voted by the scalawag legislatures. During Reconstruction, 6 million acres in the state of Mississippi were sold for back taxes. The scalawag legislatures embarked on great spending sprees, running up huge state debts to the bankers. During Reconstruction, the state debt of Louisiana increased from $14 to $48 million, in South Carolina from $7 million to $29 million, in Florida from a mere $524,000 to $5 million. The Fairfield Herald in South Carolina wrote editorially, November 20, 1872, Reconstruction, a hellborn policy, which has trampled the fairest and noblest of states, our great statehood beneath the unholy hoofs of African savages and shoulder-strapped brigands, the policy which has given up millions of our freeborn, high-souled brothers and sisters, countrymen and countrywomen, of Washington, Rutledge, Marion, and Lee, to the rule of gibbering, louse-eaten, devil-worshipping barbarians, from the jungles of Dahomey, and perpetuated by buccaneers from Cape Cod, Memphremagog, Hell, and Boston. Note that even a Southern editor knew about the devil worship of the Canaanites. Amazingly enough, this was written during the military occupation, or rather, during its close. The descendants of the carpetbaggers now own all of the Southern press, and such an editorial cannot be read anywhere in the South today. The military occupation of the South was further reinforced when President Grant passed the aptly named Force Act of 1870. This act suspended habeas corpus and placed total power in the hands of the military occupiers of the southern states. His Enforcement Acts of 1871 put congressional elections in the South under the control of federal authorities, a method which was revived in the 1960s and 1970s, when federal authorities again invaded the southern states to place elections under their supervision. These were the auspices under which the Constitution of the United States was rewritten and nullified. In 1877, 12 years after the end of the Civil War, 12 years after the 13th Amendment was ratified, 9 years after the 14th Amendment was ratified, and 7 years after the 15th Amendment was ratified, President Hayes withdrew the federal troops from the southern states. The scalawag looting of the impoverished South was typified by the career of Franklin Israel Moses Jr. in South Carolina. His father had been appointed Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of South Carolina during the period of Reconstruction, serving in that office from 1868 to 1877. Significantly, he ended his term when the federal troops were withdrawn. In 1866, Moses Jr. began to publish a newspaper, Sumter News, which enthusiastically endorsed all four of the Reconstruction Acts. He was elected as Speaker of the House by the Loyal League, a scalawag group. For more than a decade, he spent millions of dollars in lavish living, money which he accumulated by accepting bribes in office, and by filing bogus state pay vouchers for hundreds of non-existent state employees. He also dealt heavily in fraudulent state contracts. He purchased a $40,000 mansion, the equivalent of $10 million in today's money, and was renowned as the biggest spender in South Carolina. With the withdrawal of federal troops, which zealously protected the rights of such scoundrels, he came under scrutiny for his criminal acts. In 1878, to avoid prosecution, he fled to Massachusetts, where he finally died in 1906. Throughout the remainder of his life, he was known as a dope addict and confidence trickster. The Moses saga is redolent of the aroma which attended every act of the scalawags and carpetbaggers in the South. In The Tragic Era, by Claude Bowers, one of the many books which have documented the excesses of the Reconstruction period, Bowers writes on p. 29, in Louisiana, Sheridan rattling the sword, was spluttering epithets in an attempt to save the radicals he served from the destruction they merited. Bowers describes the Reconstruction as Cromwellian, an apt description. The revolution in the South which it served to introduce was in essence a Cromwellian interpretation of the Masonic Canaanite order. The mockery of election laws and indeed of the legal system under Reconstruction was remarkably exposed by Bowers when he wrote of the Dural episode. A conservative group had elected John McHenry as governor, but an illegal returning board had ignored his election and given the governorship to his opponent, W. P. Kellogg, without even counting the votes. Although a legal returning board had already certified the election of McHenry, Bowers writes, the drunken federal judge Dural, with the trembling fingers of inebriety, had written his midnight injunction against the legal returning board, and instructed U.S. Marshal Packard, the Republican manager, to take possession of the State House. The next morning, the besotted judge declared the lawful board illegal and restrained it from counting the election returns. Bowers noted that the audacity of the crime rocked the nation, terming Dural a drunken tyrant. Bowers chronicles the widespread protest against his vicious act. Today, the name of Dural is still despised in the state of Louisiana as a synonym for federal judicial tyranny. Dural was typical of the besotted Oriental despots, acting with the backing of federal troops, as they still do today, who use the Constitution of the United States as toilet tissue while they crush the people of Shem under the heels of their judicial Masonic order of Canaanite tyranny. It is the Durals who have made the federal courts the most hated institutions in American life today, in 1987, just as Dural caused them to be despised in 1872. Because of the depredations of such scalawags as Dural and Moses, the defeated Southerners had lost more than $500 million in cash during the Civil War, the result of their patriotic purchases of Confederate bonds, which were repudiated 100% by the scalawag legislatures. Only their land holdings were left. Almost half of their assets were computed in their holdings of slaves, and these were now gone. Much of their land was now confiscated, due to heavy taxation imposed by the authority of the federal troops. Of a total population of 60 million, the 10 southern states had suffered 5.5 million casualties, roughly 10%, one-fourth of the male population was dead or incapacitated by 1865. It would seem impossible for even the people of Shem to go on after such losses, yet survive they did, even though the cruel 12 years of the Reconstruction period was designed to ensure that none of them would survive. It is a fact of law that legislation enacted during periods of martial law is valid only during the period for which martial law is declared and sustained. Amazingly enough, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments have never been challenged on this basic premise of law. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, even though President Johnson informed Congress that they had no power to interfere with slavery. The 14th Amendment changed the requirements for citizenship, even though Congress had no power to act on this question. Johnson urged the Southern states to reject the 14th Amendment. He vetoed the 4 Reconstruction Acts, showing that the executive branch of the government was unalterably opposed to the excesses of the radical Republicans in Congress. The Oxford Companion to Law states, in the Middle Ages, martial law meant law administered by the court of the constable and the marshal. It now means law applicable by virtue of the royal prerogative to foreign territory occupied for the time being by the armed forces of the crown. Thus the federal troops who occupied the southern states were exercising a royal prerogative, which had nothing to do with the Constitution of the United States, hence President Johnson's veto of the Reconstruction Acts. It was the exercise of absolute power over the population by a military officer who was directly responsible to the president. No martial law has been imposed in Great Britain since the 17th century. Martial law may, exceptionally, be established within the state itself, in substitution for the organized government and administration of justice, when a state of war, or rebellion, an invasion, or other serious disturbance exists. In that event, justice is administered by its martial and military law tribunals. There cannot be two governments exercising the same authority in the same area. When the military governments were established by the Reconstruction Acts in the 10 southern states from 1865 to 1877, no other government had sovereignty in those states. Thus no legislation could be enacted except under the umbrella of martial law. Therefore, when martial law ended, all legislation enacted under martial law was void. Black's Law Dictionary says of martial law, military authority exercises control over civilians or civil authority within domestic territory. Okakubo v. Bonesteel, D.C. Chi. 60 F. Sup. 916, 928, 929, 930. Webster's Dictionary says of martial law, from Mars, Roman god of war. Law applied to all persons and property in occupied territory by the military authorities. The Oxford English Dictionary says of martial law, 1548 Hall Cron. Heniv 7b. He caused divers lusty men to apply divers older men upon matters determinable as the common law of the court martial. OED further states of martial law, that kind of military government of a country or district, in which the civil law is suspended and the military authorities are empowered to arrest all suspect persons at their discretion and to punish offenders without formal trial. 1537 Hen 8. Let DK North Street PAPRII 537. The cause of our laws must give place to the ordinances and estates martial. Our pleasure is that you shall cause such dreadful executions to be done on a good nombre of thinhabitants o every town, village and hamlet that have offended in this rebellion, and they may be a feriful spectacle to all other hereafter, that wold practice any like matter. The OED quotes Wellington as saying in 1851, on military law in Hansard, martial law was neither more nor less than the will of the general who commands the army. In fact, martial law meant no law at all. Thus these 3 amendments to the Constitution were ratified while the 10 southern states were under martial law, and had no law at all. The Force Acts, the four Reconstruction Acts, and the Civil Rights Act were all passed by Congress while the Southern states were not allowed to hold free elections, and all voters were under close supervision by federal troops. Even Soviet Russia has never staged such mockeries of the election procedures. The Congress in 1987 went even further in changing the requirements for citizenship. The Washington Post, March 17, 1987, reported that Congress was now offering sales of citizenship for $185 each, with a bargain rate of $420 for entire families. It is expected that some 2 million aliens will purchase these bargain citizenship offers. The only requirement is that they be criminals, that is, that they be present in the United States in open violation of the laws of the United States. It is the greatest threat to the people of Shem since President Carter persuaded Castro to let him have many thousands of Cuban homosexuals and criminally insane Marielitos to import into the United States. The ensuing nationwide crime wave has terrorized our cities. The Carter-Castro deal openly violated our entire mandated immigration procedures. There are two inescapable conclusions to be drawn from this record. First, that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which drastically changed qualifications for citizenship in the United States, voting rights, and other fundamental matters, were ratified while the 10 Southern states were under martial law and their rightful governments had been superseded by military force, and two, that legislation passed during periods of martial law effectively ends or is automatically repealed when martial law ends and the troops are withdrawn. The Reconstruction governments, which, as Collier's notes, could only be sustained by force, ended when that force was withdrawn. Thus these amendments to the Constitution have had no legal status since 1877, when President Hayes withdrew the federal troops from the Southern states. These amendments are and have been invalid since 1877.